you follow American politics in even the smallest way, having to be the person that gives the State of the Union in this wonderful room is a little awkward this time of year. So I'm not exactly sure if I'm in Diane's good graces right now, but we'll see. So thank you all for being here this morning. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to put this so I don't spill it. All right. So we're in a place where we teach, which means I have the ability to ask you for feedback. Real quick, how many of you have been OpenShift users in one way, shape, or form, whether it was Origin or OKD for, let's say, more than 2 years? Okay. 1 to 2 years, roughly? Anybody brand new, never used it before? This is all going to be new to you? Okay, very good. Welcome. Very good. Good. So we're gonna spend some time. I'm kind of excited today because when I look at the agenda, everybody that comes after me is going to give you way more knowledge. I'm going to try and set the tone a little bit of where we're going for this, but everybody's smarter than me, which is kind of a good thing. It means that if this isn't as good during the sort of coffee waking up period, the rest of the day will get much better. So I always talk, I've been very lucky. We've done probably a dozen of these events or so now around the world, and we've done them at KubeCons, we've done them at Red Hat Summits, we've done them independently. And I always tend to try and start with kind of where we are in terms of how the community's evolved. And I felt like this picture was kind of a good start because when we first got started doing this back in 2016, we did it at one of the KubeCons. I think it was the original or second KubeCon. The thing was very focused on the technology, on sort of the cloudiness of what it was and what do pods mean. And at the time, we weren't sure if Kubernetes was really going to be successful. And so it was very technology focused. It was very cloud focused. It had very little at the time talking about what the actual end users were doing with the technology. So the stories were all, we can spin up 100 pods or, has this code been contributed? But there was very little about, was this making anybody's business any better? Was it actually solving any problems? I think we've reached a point now where, and I think you'll see this throughout the day, the stories of what people are doing with the technology to make their lives easier from a technology perspective, improving their business, is sort of coming to the forefront. And so the clouds are sort of moving towards the background, what the stories about what people are doing to make it better. And I encourage all of you, this is a very transparent event. I had the opportunity yesterday to go meet with a couple of companies here in town. And we appreciate when folks tell us, yes, what they're doing with it, but where's it broken? Where would you like it better? So if you get the chance today, and I encourage it, meet somebody new, tell your story. There are going to be people here who are trying to solve the same problems you are. Many of them may have solved the problem you have already, and some of you will have the same sort of challenges, and we'd love to hear the feedback, but also sort of share that with each other. So when I think about sort of where we are philosophically with OpenShift, where we are as a community, but also as a technology, we're sort of always going through this transition. And keep in mind, this is about 3.5-year-old technology, so it's still very new. But as an industry, we've sort of gone through this shift over the last, say, decade plus, where we always tend to want to shift very hard in one direction in the spectrum or shift very hard in the other end of the spectrum. And we're always looking for that one bullet point that says, this is what's going to happen. So we've been through the stage where wonderful people from Harvard would say things like, IT doesn't matter. And we all worry, what does that mean? It means that all of our jobs are commoditized and there's no value in IT, it's just a cost center. And you start having organizations, C-level organizations go, maybe we don't need an IT organization, right? Maybe we don't need to think about those things and invest in those things. And then we move along and that causes its own ripples and people make certain decisions and maybe they outsource some things or whatever they do. And then other things come along and we get other philosophers who come along and say software's eating the world and that everything should be about developers and everything should be about our applications. And there's certain aspects of that that make a lot of sense. And you combine that with, I don't really need IT, and you start to go, okay, we're getting these sort of maxims that are going to cause people to think in certain ways. In some cases, it creates great new behaviors. In other cases, it causes us to go, are we sure that's what we want to do? Are we sure not investing in certain things for periods of time are going to be good things or bad things? And so we think about that, and we kind of put that into where we are today. And the reality is, when we invest in applications, it's great. But when we stop sort of thinking that certain aspects have any value whatsoever, things continue to happen, right? We continue to have viruses. We have viruses and breaches and CVEs. At the host level, we have them, for those of you maybe that have been around Kubernetes for a little bit, we had them at the Kubernetes level this year. We had some fairly significant ones. We had ones at the application level, so I just grabbed one. Spring Data had a big sort of vulnerability this year that needed to be patched. And unfortunately, and I don't pick on any companies, I just grabbed this off of a Google search, there are big companies that are vulnerable, that have vulnerabilities, that have hacks and so forth. And it's what's considered our greatest technology companies and other companies, companies that we deal with all the time. And the reason I highlight all this is that there's always going to be some spectrum that we have that says, go everything to one direction, everything in another direction. In some cases, we learn a lot from that, right? Everything should be developers write the code, developers run the code. Do we invest in IT? Do we not invest in IT? But the reality is these sort of things still happen, and they happen when we don't invest in the things that make us safe, that make things available, to make things easier to use. And somewhere in all of that sort of stew or goulash or whatever your favorite sort of food mixture is, we have to sort of find that right balance. And I use that because the reality is your boards, your C-level, they don't necessarily know what the right thing is. They see some headlines, they read some magazine, they go to a conference and they go, what's the right thing to do? They look to you to sort of figure out what's the right thing to do. They look for you to push back when they tell you that everything should be way to the right or everything should be way to the left. And quite honestly, they don't know the right answer. They don't necessarily know what should be done. They aren't necessarily thinking all the time. They're thinking if they're in the banking industry, they should worry about who's around the corner. Maybe they don't think about, Amazon just made an announcement that we're going to be in the banking industry or the grocery industry, the insurance industry. How do I treat them as a partner versus a competitor versus a so-and-so? So the opportunity in this is to figure out what is that right balance point for your business and so forth. And from our perspective, the question becomes, how do we make sure that we balance the technology that we provide for you to be able to help you in sort of wherever on that spectrum you end up, okay? So for us, and as you'll hear throughout the day, we made a huge investment back in 2014-ish timeframe around Kubernetes. We've been making a very large investment, obviously, in Linux and containers for a very, very long time. But we made a bet, kind of a crazy bet at the time. It was basically a throw the engine out of the airplane bet at the time that said, we think Kubernetes is going to be successful. We think it's a technology that's going to have communities built around it, as Diane talked about. And ultimately, it's paid off as a technology decision. But ultimately, it's something that for us says, it's a technology that's going to allow developers to be successful. It's technology that's been proven out in the big web in terms of being scalable and secure and so forth. But it's something that you have to actively invest in, okay? And you'll hear some of these numbers talked about throughout the day. We also think that the technology has evolved through a couple of generations, and that sounds crazy when we talk about it's only been around for 3 or 4 years, but obviously we all know we live in internet time, which is 1 year is 7 years or 1 year is 10 years. We feel like we've been through the first generation where we had to figure out if this technology from Google, which had sort of been proven out in their world, could work in everybody else's world. We had to figure out if it could become open source. We had to figure out whether or not they would continue to be a great contributor, whether the rest of us could figure out how to work with them. And I think we got through that very well. That second generation that we lived through was really, will it be more than just brand new applications? Because the reality is, for most people, everything isn't brand new applications. There has to be some way to take things that you run your business with today forward, whether those are lifted and shifted, whether those are modernized, or whether those are rebuilt or repurposed. And now we're really moving into sort of this third generation. I'm going to talk about this, which is how do we get out of the way to a certain extent, right? There's an expectation that IT is going to be simpler to consume, simpler being from somebody's perspective. It's going to be more self-service from somebody's perspective. And hopefully, in order to be able to do that, to be able to take on more applications, to be able to take on more developers writing code, to be able to scale it as the business needs to, it has to become much more automated, much more sort of integrated in itself. And that's really what we're going to get into. And then finally, obviously, we want to be able to make sure that as we worry about where do these things run. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody, and they told us we are going to be out of our data centers within 2 years. Okay, where are you going to put them? Yeah, we're still trying to decide, right? Who do you trust? Who's your partner? Where does your data have to reside? There are sort of geopolitical things that are going on that are going to dictate stuff that we may not know in a few years. I need to be able to know that wherever it ends up running, whether you call that hybrid or multi-cloud, that I can build consistent operations around that. And so you'll see quite a bit of focus from that perspective. So we've been reasonably successful in the market in terms of OpenShift. Thank you all who've been part of that. I think there are roughly 1,000 or so OpenShift customers, commercial customers, and obviously many more on the open source side. We really kind of took a hard look at ourselves a little more than a year ago, and we said, the technology has been successful, and the technology to a certain extent has inflicted a certain amount of grief and pain on our customers that they felt there was more business value than pain value. But going forward, if we really want to be successful in the market, and we want you to be successful in the market, we have to look at how do we cross into delivering that technology in a way that's going to be more applicable to mainstream, make it easier for you to hire people, more easy for us to maintain the software, for you to deploy it everywhere. And so we made some fairly big decisions. We made an acquisition, as many of you know, last January, roughly this time last year, of CoreOS. And a lot of that was all around this idea of not only how do we make the technology more mainstream, but more importantly, how do we make it more manageable and really capable of keeping up with the pace of change at which Kubernetes is going on. So how many of you were familiar with CoreOS before the acquisition? Okay. Anybody using CoreOS before the acquisition? Tectonic? Okay. So you'll hear quite a bit today. Mike's going to talk about some of it. Some of that technology has been integrated. If you're a 3.11 customer, some of that is going to be exposed to you, maybe about 40% of it. The rest of it will be in the OpenShift 4 time frame. So that acquisition, all of the engineering integration is being done. You'll see the fruits of that later on today and then throughout the year. We really took a very different philosophy about where we're going with this, and different from the perspective of if we think about what you tell us all the time, which is, I want you to be more like the online managed services. I don't know how much I want to manage anymore. Keeping up with the pace at which new releases are coming out is becoming more complicated for us. How do we simplify that? And so Mike's going to get into much more detail on this, but at a very high level, we basically said, where we are today, you really have to think about the chunks of the architecture somewhat independently. I don't know why that dropped down. Bare metal isn't meant to be a second-class citizen. Formatting error. But essentially, the host level things and the sort of IaaS level things had to be thought of independently. The Kubernetes level stuff had to be thought of somewhat independently. And then how you got your applications and how they integrated were somewhat independent. Where you'll see us moving is much more to where the platform from a host, cloud, sort of platform itself is going to become much more of a consistent, more of a unified type of thing. So thinking about when I want to do upgrades, I don't want to think about them somewhat independently. I want to think about them consistently. I want to be able to get those updates over the air. I want all of the capabilities that are in there to be based on Kubernetes native technologies, right? And this was part of the evolution over the last 3 years. Is when we first got started, some of those things that you needed in everyday life, whether it was logging or how networking was done or how we managed multiple clouds, there just wasn't Kubernetes native technologies available. You'll see that evolve. We've been evolving it, but you'll see that really evolve in 4.0. So again, our sort of philosophy on this has been, some of this hasn't changed, some of this is very much going to change in terms of improving. We very much believe the infrastructure should be auto-updating. We believe it should be immutable. We believe it should be secure, and I think you'll see some of that today in the demonstrations. We fundamentally believe that the things that you are using around the technology should be Kubernetes native. And the good news of that is that's not our philosophy individually, that's really the community's philosophy. You've seen how big the community's grown. We've seen storage and networking and low-level infrastructure things become much more Kubernetes native, but we've seen monitoring, logging, how the applications are being built, a whole explosion of things around how applications can be built, becoming much more Kubernetes native. And we very much believe that when you run your applications for those things that are, say, packaged and stateful and other things, they should run as a service. They should basically be deployed. They should be auto-updated. Your users should not have to think, what do I have to know about this? I should think about them as if they run just like an RDS service from Amazon and so forth. And then we fundamentally believe that this sort of unified platform, everything running on top of Kubernetes, not some mixed mash of technologies under the covers, should be able to run and is able to run existing applications, cloud-native applications, IoT, big data applications, serverless, that whole breadth of things that you're trying to do should be able to run on one consistent platform. You shouldn't have to run some of them on a sort of independent PaaS platform and some on an independent CaaS platform and then try and figure out how they go together. We fundamentally believe this is where this is going, and I think you'll see this throughout the day. A couple of things as far as highlights. The hope is that very much the stack becomes, while it's still going to be very robust, you can think about it much more in a simplified way. You're going to hear throughout the day about operators. We could talk somewhat about Windows containers. We're going to talk about some areas where we're moving sort of a marketplace approach in terms of how the ecosystem will be simpler to consume in the platform, how you'll be able to sort of deliver marketplace types things to your developers. You'll hear about things like Istios and service meshes. We'll hear about federation. All of these technologies are either right now sort of in tech or developer preview or will be first-class citizens in 4.0, which you'll hear more and more about. And then some things that we're doing to make Helm simpler to use, Knative from a serverless perspective. So all of those things are in progress. I know some of you are already beginning to use them. Mike's going to talk about them much more. But very much what I want you to take away from this is we understand that up through what we've delivered so far has been delivering business value. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't, so thank you very much for that. We also understand that it hasn't been as simple as you would like it to be, and our goal is to continue to make that simpler. You'll very much see the things that are expanded beyond Kubernetes. So all of these CNCF projects will be first-class citizens within the platform. We think they should just be native services within the platform. And you're going to be able to touch and feel this technology very soon if you're not already doing that today. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up with sort of one last picture from a different perspective here. My hope is by the end of the day, while you're going to get a lot from a technology perspective out of today, please come and ask any of us questions, where there's going to be panel sessions at the end where we can ask roadmap questions and so forth. Ask your peers about what they're doing in the business. I think you're going to find there's quite a bit of very interesting things happening from a business perspective. I think we're seeing less and less of having to be super concerned about all the cloudy stuff that happens under the covers and more how do we make this technology really applicable for the business. So with that, I'm going to bring up Mike Barrett. Mike runs all of product management for the OpenShift platform. And for many of you, he's going to show not only what's going on roadmap-wise, but also some live demonstrations. So Mike Barrett, thanks.